Okay, so we are going to look at cellular respiration here. Um, Basically, we're going to break down food within our cells. So we eat food and we digest it and we chemically break bonds to make it small enough to get into our blood. But then from our blood, it needs to get into our cells. And once it's in our cells, we need to take that energy from the bonds of the food or the glucose and turn it into usable forms of energy in the bonds of ATP. So on your test, again, you do need to know the chemical formula for cellular respiration. This is it with chemical symbols, balanced, and you can leave the energy off. But these are the four things that are involved, and it's glucose and oxygen producing water and carbon dioxide. Now, again, I'm going to give you a model. And from that model, you need to be able to explain the process where that energy is converted. So before we get to all of those steps, we do need to be able to identify all of the components of a mitochondria and the things that are involved in cellular respiration. So the entire thing is a mitochondria. Okay, so this whole thing, and then we have series of membranes. We have the outer membrane, we have the inner membrane, and the intermembrane space. The very center is called the mitochondrial matrix. Now, outside of the mitochondria, in the cytosol of the cell, so it's inside the cell membrane, is where we do our first step, where we break down the glucose. So this is glucose. This truck is NAD+. It's going to be an electron carrier. And then the second step, we have FAD, which is going to become FADH2. We also have NADs in here, but again, we're simplifying a complex process to make it easier to understand. In this last stage of cellular respiration, we have the electron transport chain, where we're going to have these series of proton pumps, and the little gray dots are the protons. We also have ATP synthase, which is a channel in an enzyme where most of the ATP is going to be created. And finally, we also have oxygen that's going to get involved. So if we're moving on to these steps, the very first thing we do is split the sugar. So glucose is broken down into two pyruvates. We make a little ATP, and we also carry those electrons, those high energy electrons, the hydrogen, to the electron transport chain. Those two pyruvates are going to proceed to go into the matrix. So we get a little ATP before we even use mitochondria at all. In the second step, those pyruvates are broken down into carbon dioxide, which is going to exit the cell. By breaking those down, we get a little bit of a lot of electrons to be carried to the electron transport chain. We also make a little bit of ATP. This stage is called the Krebs cycle. The third, fourth, fifth, and sixth step are all part of the electron transport chain. So the NADs and FADs, NADH and FADH2, drop off those high energy electrons, which power the pumps. Again, we have a higher concentration of protons out here than in here. So this is going to be active transport, and active transport requires energy. The energy for that transport comes from those high energy electrons. So that's the third step. Electrons power the pumps. The fourth step, the protons are going to get pumped. They're actively transported to the intermembrane space. Then they're going to come back and they're going to diffuse back in, but they diffuse through ATP synthase. As they diffuse back in, we get a tremendous amount of ATP. The vast majority of the ATP is created at the end of the electron transport chain. Now, in order for this process to continue, we need to clear off these electrons from the pumps, and oxygen is going to help do that. So oxygen is going to accept the electrons and some protons, and this now makes water. So we say oxygen cleans up and makes water. It takes the electrons and the protons. And that's basically it. I think it's less complicated than photosynthesis. And this is the whole very advanced version of it. And this is what it looks like when all the steps are put together. So what I'm going to try and do here is also show it to you guys if I were to hand draw it as if I were taking the test. So Again, we have, this is glucose, C6H12O6. And this over here is going to be oxygen. We're going to call it O2. But our first step here, very first thing we're going to do is split the sugar. So you see how I split it? As that happens, we are going to make some ATP here. And we're also going to carry some electrons. So that's glycolysis, and these electrons are getting transported to the electron transport chain. These two pyruvates are going to go into the matrix. So now we have 2 3-carbon molecules, the split sugar. So now we're on to step 2. At step 2, we break this down the rest of the way. As we break all of that down into carbon dioxide, we make a little more ATP, and we carry a lot of electrons to the electron transport chain. So now at step 3, these trucks, or these electron carriers, the NADs and the FADs, are dropping off the electrons at the pumps, and those pumps are now going to be powered up, which brings us to step 4. The protons get pumped, and then from there we go to step 5, where we are going to have protons diffuse back in through ATP synthase, which is going to create a lot of ATP. Our final and 6th step is when oxygen comes in. It's going to take the electrons, take some protons, and we are going to get water. And that is our 6th step. So again, split the sugar, make ATP, transport electrons. Step 2, break down the split sugar into carbon dioxide, make some ATP, carry a lot of electrons. Step 3, at the electron transport chain, we drop off the electrons, which power the pumps. Step 4, the protons get pumped. Step 5, the protons diffuse back in through ATP synthase, and we get a lot of ATP. Step 6, oxygen comes up, cleans up the electrons and the protons, and we get water. And that is cellular respiration. If we look at this from a formula standpoint, what is going in is glucose and oxygen. From that, we are producing CO2 and water. Again, that's cellular respiration. If we balance it, in order to, when we break this down, we get 6 oxygen, 6 carbon dioxide, and 6 water. All right, so hopefully that's helpful.